Grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus the Christ. Well, back in the days when the telegraph was the newfangled technology, the fastest mode of communication, it, like the technology of today, was embraced by young people. How cool was that to send messages across this, miles of metal wire through an electric current? How cool was that? And so many young people applied for jobs in the telegraph industry, whether they were out in the field putting up the lines or whether they were in the office. They wanted to be part of it. And so one young man in a bustling city where there was going to be a lot of messages coming in and out signed up to be, or applied to be, a Morse code operator. Those little buttons we see on the Western movies a lot where they tap the buttons and makes the little clicking sounds. So he went to the office where he was instructed to go, grabbed an application, filled it out, went into the room where he was told to wait. And in there were about 5 or 6 other people. There was bustling going on. You could hear Morse code clicking away in the background. And so he sat there for a few moments and kind of was looking around at the other people. But all of a sudden, this guy gets up and steps up, walks over, and goes into the manager's office. And of course, all the other guys are sitting there and like, what in the world is up with him? The nerve of that guy. But of course, they thought how glad they'll be when they watch him being unceremoniously dragged out and kicked into the street for being so presumptuous. Well, to their surprise, the door opened up, the young man stepped out, but the manager came out with his hand on the shoulder and said, "Thank you all for your applications, but we found our new employee." Shocked, most of them just kind of walked out. But one guy just had to know what was going on. How could this guy, so rude, walking into the manager's office without being asked, and coming back out and being the new employee? Well, the manager told him, "Didn't you hear the Morse code that was being clicked? It said, if you can understand this message, come into the office, the job is yours." Only one guy. Everyone else was standing there expecting to be told to hear a voice as normal. Somebody would come out, invite them in for an interview, have all their resumes, and explain why they should have this job. Only one person actually heard the message. How do we hear God's voice in our lives? And how does God speak to us? Are we ready? Would we hear God speaking to us? Are we ready for the unexpected? This is what's going on in today's story with Elijah. Now, we don't get the whole story, unfortunately. It's a little bit of an abridged version, but this is where he goes to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments, another experience of hearing God's voice. And Elijah goes there and pleads his case before God. He's done. He's had it. So unexpected from Elijah, because this is happening immediately following his moment of glory up at Mount Carmel. Does anybody remember the story where he's up against those hundreds of prophets of Baal? And they're in this contest between whose God is better, Baal or the one true God, the God of Israel. And we know the story. The prophets of Baal had their altar and their cow on the altar, and they were screaming out to Baal, bring fire down and consume this offering. And Elijah's kind of actually sitting back, kind of making fun of him. Hey, he might be asleep. Yell a little louder. And they yelled louder and even cut themselves, hoping that Baal would have mercy and compassion and consume their offering. And of course, nothing happened. So when it was Elijah's turn, not only did he not go through all that, but he had buckets of water dumped on his offering to make it that much harder for God to consume it with fire. And of course, all he did was kneel down and pray, and boom, all this fire comes down, totally consumes his offering. All the water completely gone. And of course, all of the people that were there, were inspired and awed and said, yes, the God of Israel is the one true God. Even King Ahab was there and was inspired. And so Elijah, in that moment of glory and triumph, actually even outran King Ahab's chariot back into Samaria. But then one little thing changed his whole perspective. Queen Jezebel threatens his life, sends a messenger to him and says, "You're dead." And that sends Elijah into this extreme despair. And he runs away. He's up in the northern part and runs all the way to Beersheba, and then goes even farther down into the Sinai Peninsula and asks God, "Just kill me now. It's not worth it. I've done all this stuff, and I just can't take it anymore. Nobody cares. I alone am left." Whine, whine, whine. And so in our story, we get to this point where God is finally going to meet Elijah. So Elijah goes up onto Mount Sinai, and God says, "Step to the entrance of the cave, and I will come by." And what do we see? First, there's a big, huge earthquake. But God wasn't in the earthquake. Then there was a big wind, and it says God wasn't in the wind. And that's actually very strange, because in times past, we see that's how God has spoken. In a lot of stories in the Bible, God makes his presence known in those very dramatic ways, through winds or fires or earthquakes or storms of some kind. But where does it say God actually was? Where was the voice of God heard? Sheer silence. This still, small voice is where God finally speaks to Elijah. Plain, right? Not the dramatic, not the kind that someone would think this God who had just sent all that dramatic fire down would speak. But he uses a still, small voice to speak to Elijah. Why do you think that is? Why would he do that? After all Elijah has been through, wouldn't God continue to show his power and his awe by doing something in an earthquake or a wind or a fire? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why God would choose to do a still, small voice. First of all, when somebody's talking like this, don't you have to listen harder? You have to calm yourself down, and you actually have to do active listening to hear what's going on. Less chance of you getting the message messed up, because you have to really work at it to hear. So God was calming Elijah down. Here he was, first of all, he'd gone from one extreme, from this victorious, mighty prophet, to a guy who's just a whiner, even wanting God to kill him. And so God needs to settle him down and take some quiet time and have Elijah really listen to him. Active listening. Total focus on what God is saying. But second, I think God is using that still, small voice because that's how we normally encounter life. Life isn't all about the emotional highs. Life isn't all about the big, dramatic moments. Those happen. Those kind of keep us going from one moment to the next. But most of life, we have to admit, is not like that. Most of life is just going on like normal. And we can hear God in the normal things. We don't have to wait for those big emotional moments to hear God. Like Elijah, sometimes God is going to speak to us very plainly, just like in the story of the telegraph guy. The message was there all along, right there, chatting along in the background, but he had to quiet himself and hear it. A little bit unexpected, but so normal, especially if he was going to be a telegraph operator. He's going to be hearing that for a long time. And so he was ready. And it was going to be his daily chore to listen to those telegraph messages coming and going. We just had a special service last week, exciting, 140th anniversary of this congregation, and another birthday thrown in, so something special. But does that mean that's the only time God speaks to us? I know that church can sometimes feel like a routine, but it's kind of supposed to. One week after another almost seems like it's the same thing. And that's what it's supposed to be. Because God works in the normal, everyday things. I know there are a lot of kids who can't wait for Camp Luther. They go up on that mountain and have this wonderful experience because it really is. It's all about them, and that's great. But there's 51 other weeks of the year. They can't have that mountaintop experience all the time. We've got to be able to hear God in the common, everyday path of life. And this is why God speaks to us in still, small voices. I think it's kind of funny sometimes. I hear people say, well, why doesn't God speak today like he did back in the Bible? Well, he does. There's plenty of examples of when God does something like this. Yes, he did talk sometimes through fire and through earthquakes and through wind, through something highly dramatic. But there are also plenty of examples of when he did this. Still, small voices. At the beginning of 1 Samuel, after the judges had done their job and life was settling down into normal, it said the voice of God wasn't heard like it had been. And the first character we have in 1 Samuel is the prophet Eli, the priest Eli. And it says he just faithfully goes about his day, making the sacrifices for the people. Just everyday thing. Nothing exciting, nothing dramatic, just life as usual. God does talk like that to us, just like he did back in the Bible. We may not think he's there, but if we still ourselves and listen closely, we'll be able to hear it, just like that telegraph operator started listening to the telegraph message. And finally, I think God uses still small voices, these normal means of communication, because the message he has for us is to go out and live normal lives. He doesn't ask us always to go out and do these dramatic things. Look at what he tells Elijah. Look at the message that he gives Elijah when Elijah finally settled down and heard God's still small voice. Now, I know it's the most boring part of the passage, but it's probably the most important. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. Anoint Elisha of Shaphat." All these names, all these hard words. Can't we just get past it and get back to the fire and action? Don't we, whenever we're reading the Bible on our own, don't we sometimes tend to skim over that stuff? It's boring. It's hard to read. But what God is telling Elijah to do is to go back and do your prophetic duty. That was the job of prophets back then, to go and anoint kings, to anoint his successor, because he's going to be leaving the earth soon. It's the reality of it all. So go and do your job. Go and do what I have called you to do. I am reaffirming that this is who I've called you to be. Yes, you're down right now. Yes, you've had that amazing experience and now people want to kill you, but I'm not done with you just yet. The still small voice of God speaks to us and tells us to just go along and do what we're. And I guarantee that most of us are called just to do normal, everyday things. And that's fine. That's perfect. God hasn't called all of us to go out and be missionaries in Africa or India. He hasn't called us to go to the Peace Corps and to rescue people, to be refugees. He's called us to do what it is we're doing. And now, as he speaks to us in those still, small voices, he's reaffirming that that's what he's called us to do. So go and do what God has called you to do faithfully, joyfully, witnessing the power and the presence of God. But we can only do that until we slow ourselves down, quiet ourselves, and hear that still small voice of God. That's there.